The first time I saw the number, I thought it had to be a typo. $150 per day, stacking like poker chips on my kitchen counter, unless I fixed what the board called a non-compliant exterior condition before the Friday hearing. They didn't say repaint the grass in those exact words, but that was the only way their demand made any sense: make my lawn lighter by the end of the week or face fines, a lien, and, if they pushed it far enough, an auction. I always thought those kinds of HOA nightmare stories were exaggerated, the sort of thing people tell at barbecues to make their own lives sound more dramatic. Then I unfolded that certified letter on a quiet Monday morning, and suddenly I was the main character in one. The irony was that our house wasn't the one falling apart. We lived in Cypress Ridge, a gated suburb that was obsessed with appearances. Every cul-de-sac had a fountain, every mailbox matched, every streetlight was the same soft bronze. On clear evenings, you could hear sprinklers ticking in unison down the block, and the smell of fertilizer hung in the air like some weird neighborhood cologne. The only thing that set our place apart was the lawn. While everyone else fought the summer drought with endless watering and chemical treatments, we went the opposite direction. We had a darker fescue mix and drought-friendly ground cover, a lawn that looked like deep green velvet instead of neon carpet. It grew slower, needed less water, and didn't burn out in August. It was darker than our neighbors, sure, but it was healthy, even, and fully approved when we moved in. Or so I thought. When I first opened the envelope that morning, the paper crackled loudly in the quiet kitchen, like it wanted to be dramatic about what it was about to say. The letterhead had the association's logo, embossed and self-important. Below that, in bold, was the violation: non-uniform landscape appearance, parcel 18B. Under it, the fine schedule: $150 per day, starting 10 days from the date of the notice, continuing until verified compliance. Buried in the middle, one line punched me in the chest. A hearing had been scheduled for Friday at 6 p.m. Failure to appear, the letter said, could result in additional enforcement actions, including a lien and potential foreclosure remedies authorized by the governing documents. There it was, wrapped in legal phrasing: change your lawn, or we'll eventually come for your house. I set the letter down and stared out the window at the yard. The morning light made the darker grass look almost velvety, and a slight breeze rippled across it like someone had run a hand through fabric. The edges were clean, the shrubs trimmed, the walkway swept. If this was what counted as a neighborhood emergency, our board had way too much free time. But I already knew where this was coming from. It had a name, and it wore pastel cardigans. Our HOA president, Linda P., liked to call herself the community standards champion. No one had asked her to champion anything. The role seemed to be something she awarded herself, the way some people give themselves a nickname and hope it sticks. She lived 3 doors down in the corner lot, the one with identical flower pots lined up like soldiers and a lawn so bright it almost glowed under the streetlights. You could tell when she was on patrol. Her little white crossover would crawl around the loop at 5 miles an hour, windows cracked, a clipboard on the passenger seat. Sometimes she walked, phone in hand, pretending to scroll while her eyes scanned driveways and doorways and hedges. On warm afternoons, you could hear the faint squeak of her sneakers on the sidewalk as she marched past, scanning for offenses. When we first moved in, we tried to play nice. We went to one of the association's monthly meetings in the clubhouse, just to see how things worked. The room smelled like coffee and dry erase markers, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Linda sat at the front with a laminated agenda and a stack of thick binders: the covenants, conditions and restrictions, the design guidelines, the rules and regulations. The board introduced themselves, Linda as president, Mr. K as treasurer, and a couple of other volunteers who mostly looked tired. Back then, the lawn wasn't an issue. We had submitted a simple landscape modification request during escrow, just to be safe. It was a 1-page form: name, lot number, description, a quick sketch. We attached a photo of the darker fescue from the nursery brochure. A month later, we got a single-page approval stamped in blue ink: approved as submitted, DRB. It went into a file in our kitchen drawer and never crossed my mind again. That stamped approval would become my favorite piece of paper in the world later. At the time, it was just one more thing you sign when you move into a community that likes rules a little too much. The real drama started when the drought restrictions kicked in harder. The city sent notices about watering days, and the association sent its own reminders, talking about responsible stewardship and fines for wasting water. One evening, as the sun was dropping behind the roofs and the cicadas were buzzing in the trees, I looked around at all the emerald green lawns on the street and realized our darker, slower-growing yard was the only one that didn't look like it had been propped up by a chemistry set. I figured the board would love that. Less water, still green, still neat. Instead, it painted a target on our house. What I didn't know yet was that Linda had an entire mental catalog of what she thought Cypress Ridge green should look like. And to her, our lawn wasn't deep green or drought-friendly. It was dark, and dark, in her mind, meant dead-looking, even if it wasn't dead at all. Weeks before that certified letter, she had already started circling. The first sign was a generic email from the association about maintaining harmonious curb appeal, with a line about avoiding extremes in color or texture. I skimmed it and deleted it. It sounded like the usual boilerplate. Then we got a courtesy reminder in the mail, a half-page note that said some parcels were showing inconsistent lawn coloration. No addresses, no names. But the timing wasn't subtle. I'd see Linda pause near our driveway, tilt her head, and then tap something into her phone. I'd glance around and see that the only inconsistent coloration in sight was our deeper green. The morning of the violation notice, the sky was that bright, washed-out blue you get right before a heatwave, and a few sprinklers were still hissing at the far end of the street. I held the letter up to the light like that might make the words less aggressive. It didn't. The fines were real. The hearing was real. The threat was very real. That was my first real taste of what abuse of power looks like when it's wrapped in neighborhood politeness. And the board had no idea yet how hard I was willing to push back. That afternoon, I pulled out the old welcome packet the title company had given us when we closed on the house. It was a dusty white binder with the Cypress Ridge logo and a spine that cracked when I opened it. Inside, there were tabs for articles, bylaws, rules, design. The pages smelled faintly of toner and whatever air freshener the office had used. Tucked into the design section was our original landscape modification approval. The date in the corner read, approved, March 3rd. The form described our lawn exactly, drought-tolerant fescue mix, darker green shade, low water usage. Below that, in neat handwriting, the design review board chair had written, approved, maintains harmonious aesthetic. It had a blue stamp and a scribbled signature. That piece of paper was my first real evidence prop. It told me one thing very clearly: if the board was now calling our lawn non-uniform, they were contradicting their own written approval. The violation letter referenced something I hadn't noticed before, Bylaw 4.12, landscaping and exterior surfaces. It sounded official enough that I flipped through the binder until I found it. The section heading was dry and technical, but one phrase jumped out at me. Bylaw 4.12 said that all landscaping had to present a substantially uniform appearance consistent with the community aesthetic, but it also had a line about encouraging water-wise and drought-tolerant choices that do not materially detract from neighborhood harmony. The word encouraging stuck in my mind. So did do not materially detract. That was lawyer language for, we can't just decide we don't like something because it irritates us. What really bothered me, though, was the inconsistency. Our lawn wasn't the only one that looked different. Mr. K, the treasurer, had a patchy slope on the side of his lot where the grass always ran a little thin and yellow. The house across the cul-de-sac had a mix of grass and creeping thyme that, while gorgeous, was definitely a different color than the lots on either side. Someone down the next street had artificial turf that looked almost blue in certain light. None of them had bright white notices taped to their doors. That's when the pattern snapped into focus. This wasn't about a rule. It was about control. And more specifically, it was about Linda deciding that our yard offended her sense of how the street should look. The deadline wasn't just about the grass. If I didn't prove the board was abusing its power before that Friday hearing, those daily fines would keep piling up until they had enough leverage to drag us into a lien and talk about auctioning the house. The certified letter said the fines would start accumulating 10 days from the date on the notice. The date printed at the top was a Thursday, which meant the fine clock started the following Sunday. The hearing was that Friday. That gave us less than a week to either cave in and change the lawn color or dismantle their case, one clause at a time. I sat at the kitchen table with the binder open, the violation letter beside it, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room as the sunlight moved slowly across the floor. The situation felt unreal, but the numbers were sharp enough to snap me back, $150 per day, potentially for weeks, on top of our regular dues. That was real money, and the board was treating it like a casual nudge. I started making a list. On one page, I wrote every phrase from Bylaw 4.12 that hinted at flexibility: substantially uniform, consistent, encouraging water-wise, do not materially detract. On another, I began listing every house I could remember that wasn't perfectly uniform in color, shape, or style: the patchy slope, the creeping time, the artificial turf. I realized I needed proof, not just memory. So that evening, as the heat finally broke and a soft breeze rolled down the street, I walked the neighborhood with my phone. I didn't lurk or sneak, I just walked like any other resident, snapping wide shots of front yards from the sidewalk, making sure I captured landscape variety without focusing on windows or people. My goal wasn't to embarrass anyone. It was to show that uniform had always been interpreted loosely until our lawn annoyed the wrong person. In the fading light, you could see different shades of green everywhere. Some lawns had brown patches near the curb. Others had darker stripes from mowing. A few had ornamental grasses that were practically silver. If our lawn was a violation, half the street was guilty. By the time I got back home, the sky was deep blue and the first porch lights were flicking on. From somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then went quiet. I sat back down with my binder and my photos and realized something important. If I played this right, this wasn't just going to be a fight over grass color. This could be the moment the board's habit of selective enforcement finally caught up with them. I printed the violation letter again, this time with my notes scribbled in the margins. Next to the reference to Bylaw 4.12, I wrote, "Show examples of inconsistent enforcement." I circled substantially uniform and underlined it twice. If they wanted to hang their case on a vague phrase, I was going to show exactly how vague it had always been. The more I dug through the binder, the more I realized how sloppy the association had become over the years. There were addendums stapled crookedly to the back, and a landscape color guidelines sheet that looked like it had been copied from an older community and never updated. The sheet had a list of recommended grass varieties that didn't even match what the local nurseries were selling anymore. In the margins, someone had handwritten, "Consult DRB for drought-tolerant alternatives." There was no date, no initials. It was like the board had been making up rules as they went, leaving breadcrumbs but never cleaning up the trail. One thing did stand out, though: the board had clearly anticipated drought-friendly changes. They just hadn't imagined someone would choose a darker, richer shade of green instead of a paler one. That disconnect was going to be important later. Even then, at the kitchen table, I could feel the shape of the argument forming. They would say non-uniform. I would say approved, water-wise, and not materially detracting. They would say eyesore. I would say selective enforcement. The more I thought about it, the more I saw how personal this had become. On paper, it was the association sending the fines. In reality, it was Linda using the board's power to push one family into conforming to her taste. The others might sign the letters, but the fingerprints were hers. As the day faded and the house grew quieter, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let a self-appointed standards champion rewrite our approval history just because our lawn offended her sense of uniformity. I closed the binder and stacked it beside the violation letter, the original, approved as submitted, form on top like a shield. The clock was ticking toward Friday. And if the board thought I was going to roll over before that hearing, they were about to find out how wrong they were. The first real crack in the board's story showed up 2 days after that kitchen table research session. It came in the form of a bright orange tag looped around our front doorknob. The plastic was stiff and glossy, and when I picked it up, it made a sharp snap in my hand. On one side was the association logo, on the other was a checklist of possible violations with little boxes next to each one. Only one box was marked, landscaping, non-uniform or eyesore condition. Below it, someone had scribbled, "See cert." Notice, in all caps. The ink was slightly smudged, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry or pressing too hard. The tag wasn't mailed. It was placed. That meant someone had walked up to the house, stood on our porch, and made sure anyone driving by could see that bright orange hanging there. I pulled it off and felt my jaw tighten. It wasn't enough that they'd sent the certified letter, now they wanted a public marker, a little sign saying, "This house is in trouble." In a neighborhood that worshipped appearances, that tag was a scarlet letter. I took a picture of it on our welcome mat before I threw it in the drawer with the other documents. If the board wanted to turn this into a petty show, I was going to keep every prop. The next few days turned into a weird kind of surveillance game. As the late afternoon sun turned the cul-de-sac a soft gold and sprinklers clicked on in a staggered rhythm, I noticed cars slowing down a little more in front of our house. Some drivers pretended to check their mirrors. Others glanced straight at the lawn, eyes narrowing like they were trying to decide how offended to be. A couple of neighbors who usually waved started pretending they were absorbed in their phones when they walked past. They would look at the grass, then at the notice slot on our door, as if expecting another tag to appear at any second. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was there, a slight hesitation in their step, a small change in how they said hello, a sideways glance at the darker green. The board didn't need to fine us yet to make a point. Just hinting that we were non-compliant was enough to start the social pressure working. Meanwhile, I kept digging. By the time the week was half over, I had a neat stack of printed photos showing every lawn on our loop that didn't match the so-called Cypress Ridge green. I had images of the patchy slope at Mr. K's place, the time-covered yard across the way, the artificial turf down the block. In each photo, I made sure the house numbers were out of frame. This wasn't about attacking neighbors, it was about showing the rules had always been bent in practice. I also found an old association newsletter in the binder, dated a few years back. It talked about embracing drought-tolerant landscaping and showed a photo of a model home with a mix of stone, shrubs, and a lawn noticeably darker than the examples on the landscape color guidelines sheet. The caption called it a sustainable, modern twist. I circled that photo in red pen. The more I saw, the more clear it became that the board didn't have a consistent standard at all. They had preferences. And when someone with power has preferences and access to a fine schedule, things can go sideways fast. The conflict rising part wasn't just the paperwork. It was the weird little moments that came with it. One evening, I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was going down and the streetlights were flickering on. Across the street, I saw Linda standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, looking at our lawn. She wasn't trying to hide it. She stood there, head tilted, like she was inspecting a painting she already hated but had to keep staring at. She saw me, turned, and walked away without a word. No wave, no polite nod. Just a sharp turn and a faster stride, her sneakers tapping against the concrete. That told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, an email showed up from the management company with the subject line, "Hearing Notice Packet, Parcel 18B." Attached was a PDF with the formal agenda for Friday's hearing. Our issue was listed as Item 3, Non-Uniform Landscape Appearance, Enforcement Review. The description said the board would consider fines and further enforcement actions. I printed that agenda and slid it into a clear sheet protector. It sat next to the violation letter and our original, approved as submitted, form. The stack was starting to look like the opening act of a courtroom drama, and I realized that in a quiet, suburban way, that's exactly what this was turning into. By the time Friday crept closer, the quiet annoyance had calcified into something else. I wasn't just irritated anymore. I was insulted. We had followed the process, gotten approval, done our part for the drought, and kept the place neat. In return, the association's president had decided our lawn offended her sense of uniformity and was now trying to use a $150 per day threat to get her way. This wasn't just about grass. This was how abuse of power looks when it's dressed up as community standards. The escalation phase officially began on Wednesday morning when I opened the mailbox and saw another certified envelope staring up at me. The sky was a hard, bright blue that day, and the air already felt hot even though it was barely 10. I could hear the faint buzz of a lawnmower somewhere down the street as I tore the envelope open right there on the sidewalk. Inside was something new: final notice, hearing and lien warning, parcel 18B. The document was more aggressive than the first. It referenced the original violation and repeated the $150 per day fine, but it added a new paragraph near the bottom, boxed in like it needed a spotlight. The paragraph stated that if the violation remained unresolved after the hearing, the board was authorized to record a lien against the property in accordance with Bylaw 4.12 and related enforcement provisions. It claimed the board had full discretion to determine whether the lawn was consistent with the community aesthetic. In the upper corner, in bold, was the date, final notice dated May 12. That date would become my second favorite piece of evidence. It pinned the escalation to a specific moment, the day they decided to hint that auctioning the house was a real endpoint if we didn't cave. I took the notice inside and set it on the table, next to the morning coffee mug and the hum of the dishwasher. The house felt too quiet compared to the loudness of those words. I pulled out a notebook and started running numbers. 10 days of non-compliance at $150 per day was already $1,500 on the line. If they dragged this out for a month, that was $4,500 before any legal fees or lien charges. Even if you assumed they would back off before foreclosure, the threat alone could hammer someone already on a tight budget. We weren't in danger of losing the house overnight, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the board was using the idea of a lien and auction as a pressure tool, banking on the fear to make us repaint the lawn to their liking. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a petty disagreement about lawn aesthetics. We were standing at the edge of a situation where one unchecked board could convert a minor annoyance into thousands of dollars of fines and the looming possibility of losing a home, all because one person didn't like the shade of green out front. If we let them get away with that, what would they decide to go after next? I spent the rest of that day reading everything I could find in the binder and online about enforcement, liens, and owner rights. I learned that even in the strictest communities, boards weren't supposed to act like monarchs. They had procedures, notice requirements, and limits on fines. In our own documents, there were lines about reasonable enforcement and avoiding arbitrary or capricious decisions. Those words mattered. Arbitrary. Capricious. That was exactly what this felt like. There was something else hidden in Bylaw 4.122, something I had skimmed before but now understood better. The same section that talked about uniformity also said that any owner making good faith efforts toward water-efficient landscaping would be accommodated to the greatest extent consistent with community aesthetics. Good faith efforts. Accommodated. Those words were going straight into my argument. I began drafting a summary document in plain language, something I could hand to the board at the hearing. On one page, I laid out the timeline: original approval in March, drought reminders from the city, our choice of drought-tolerant mix, courtesy notices, the violation letter, the orange door tag, the final notice dated May 12. On another page, I listed the exact lines from Bylaw 4.12 that supported our case. Then I added a third page, examples of non-uniform landscaping approved or tolerated. I placed small thumbnail images of the other yards alongside bullet points noting how long they had been that way. No house numbers. No names. Just proof that uniform had always been a flexible term. As I clipped the pages together, I realized I was building more than a defense. I was quietly assembling the bones of what could become a very satisfying, very suburban HOA revenge story if things went our way. To round out the packet, I emailed the management company and politely requested a copy of the agenda for the upcoming board meeting after our hearing. When the PDF arrived, I scanned it and smiled when I saw our issue listed again, with a line that read, 18B, non-uniform landscape appearance, possible fine increase, possible lien direction. I printed that agenda excerpt and highlighted our line. That page went into a separate sleeve. By now, my stack of documents had turned into a mini binder. Tabs marked each section: approvals, Bylaw 4.12, photos, notices, agenda. Each tab was another piece of weight on our side of the scale. As the day of the hearing crept closer, the weather stayed stubbornly sunny, the kind of bright, unforgiving light that made every patch of grass stand out. Our lawn, darker and cooler toned, almost looked like shade pooled across the yard. To me, it was peaceful. To a person obsessed with uniform brightness, it probably looked like defiance. The morning before the hearing, the air was still and heavy. No breeze, no distant lawnmower sounds, just the low, constant hum of air conditioners kicking on across the neighborhood as the sun climbed. I stepped outside and took one more wide photo of our yard from the sidewalk. The grass blades had a soft sheen where the morning sprinklers had left tiny droplets clinging to them. Edges trimmed, walkway brushed, shrubs neat. If someone wanted to call this an eyesore, they were going to have to do it with a straight face. Inside, I laid my binder on the dining table and flipped through each section one more time. Original approval, violation notices, final notice dated May 12, agenda excerpt, photos, Bylaw 4.12 excerpts. Every time I saw the word accommodated in that bylaw, it reminded me that the association had written these rules, not me. If they were now pretending that water-wise, darker lawns were forbidden, they were contradicting their own language. I thought about how this would look to an outsider. A volunteer board, a president with a taste for bright, identical lawns, a homeowner who had followed the approval process and was now being threatened with daily fines and a lien. It didn't look like enforcement. It looked like someone had weaponized personal taste. This wasn't just a random Karen neighbor drama. It was a small, polished example of how power, when unchecked, reaches for whatever tool is easiest, even if that tool is a fine schedule that could ruin somebody's month. By this point, we had moved from a simple approval to a full conflict, a darker drought-friendly lawn, a president who hated it, a series of notices culminating in a final notice dated May 12, and a hearing where the board claimed it had full discretion under Bylaw 4.12. I had answered with a binder of approvals, photos, and the board's own language on accommodating water-wise choices, all set against a backdrop of obvious selective enforcement on our street. The escalation wasn't just on paper anymore, it had seeped into the way people looked at our house when they walked by. A few neighbors had quietly asked what was going on, their voices lowered even in open air as if talking about the association too loudly might summon it. I explained the basics, the approved lawn, the sudden issue, the hearing. Some shook their heads. One person mentioned they had wanted to try a different grass mix but decided against it because they didn't want the hassle. That told me the board had been quietly ruling by fear for a while. In the back of my mind, I knew that win or lose, this was already bigger than our yard. It was about setting a line. If they could bully one homeowner into repainting their lawn to match a palette that only existed in Linda's head, they could do it again, and again, until every house looked like a copy-paste template. The hearing on Friday wasn't going to fix everything. But it could plant a flag. The retaliation phase didn't start with anything loud. It began quietly, the evening before the hearing, with me sitting at the dining table while the last light faded out of the windows and the cicadas started buzzing in the trees outside. The air had that slightly cooler edge that comes just before night, and the soft glow from the overhead light turned my binder pages a warm off-white. I added one more piece to the collection, a simple, one-page cover letter addressed to the board. In it, I laid things out in calm, measured language. I reminded them of our original approval, quoted the exact description of our drought-tolerant fescue mix, darker green shade, and pointed out that the design review board had already found it consistent with the community aesthetic. I cited Bylaw 4.12 and its language about encouraging water-wise choices and accommodating owners making good faith efforts. Then I calmly noted the existence of multiple other non-uniform lawns that had never been tagged or fined. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse them of anything explosive. I simply used their own words and their own uneven enforcement pattern as a mirror. Behind that calm tone, though, there was a strategic plan starting to form. I created a simple chart on another page, a 3-column table. Column 1 listed each enforcement action against us: courtesy notice, violation letter, orange door tag, final notice dated May 12, hearing notice. Column 2 listed the date. Column 3 listed the specific rules cited. At the bottom, I added a line: no evidence of prior written concern about lawn color, despite existing approval on file. That chart became my third major evidence prop. It showed, in black and white, that the board had gone from zero to lien warning without any consistent logic other than a sudden dislike of a darker lawn. My quiet retaliation wasn't about shouting at a meeting or firing off angry emails. It was about walking into that hearing with so much organized proof that if the board still tried to force us to change the lawn, they would have to do it while staring at a timeline, their own approval stamps, and photos showing how selectively they had been enforcing uniformity. And they would have to do it in front of neighbors who were already starting to whisper about the association's habits. At the workshop, the DRB presented a sample palette of acceptable lawn shades, including darker greens that were almost a perfect match for our fescue. They showed photos of model yards with stone, shrubs, and drought-tolerant ground cover that deviated from the classic bright lawn template. They talked about balancing visual cohesion with water responsibility. Sitting in the back row, I watched neighbors nod as they looked at the examples. Some of the same people who had hesitated before walking past our house now pointed to the darker samples and whispered about trying them. You didn't need a spotlight or a microphone to see the shift. The standard had expanded, and it wasn't just to accommodate us. It was to catch up to reality. The second change was even more telling. At the next regular board meeting, attendance doubled. People who had never bothered to show up before now sat in those metal chairs, agendas in hand, listening more closely when enforcement practices came up. A few owners asked pointed questions about how violations were selected for enforcement. They did it politely, but there was a new edge in their curiosity. The board responded with phrases like consistency and procedure, but everyone in that room knew you only get that many questions when people stop believing everything is being handled fairly in the background. In the months that followed, I noticed something else. Bright orange door tags became rare. Courtesy emails sounded more measured, more specific. Landscape issues were almost always routed through the DRB first, with written findings attached. The association started documenting things more carefully, which meant fewer opportunities for someone to quietly turn a personal preference into a punishment. Our lawn, meanwhile, stayed exactly the same. The DRB review came and went with barely a ripple. They noted that the darker color was within the now updated range, that the lawn was healthy and well maintained, and that it met the goals of both community aesthetics and water-wise stewardship. No conditions. No warnings. One afternoon, as the late sun slid down behind the houses and painted the street a soft orange, I stood on the sidewalk and realized our yard no longer looked like a problem in anyone's eyes. It looked like what it always had been, a reasonable, approved choice. Sometimes retaliation isn't loud. Sometimes it's something smaller but more satisfying, quietly forcing a system that tried to bully you into rewriting its own rules so it can't do the same thing so easily again. If someone ever makes a documentary about HOA ridiculous rules, this whole situation will absolutely have a chapter in it, but not because we lost. It will be there because one of those little cases, the kind that usually ends with someone resentment buying sod and keeping their head down, didn't end that way this time. It ended with a board having to stare at its own bylaws, its own uneven enforcement, and its own threat to turn a lawn into a lien, and then walk that threat back under the fluorescent lights of the clubhouse, in front of the people they were supposed to serve. It ended with neighbors realizing they were allowed to ask questions. It ended with a darker lawn still standing. In the end, what started as a petty battle over grass turned into my own quiet HOA revenge story. Not the explosive kind, not the sort with shouting matches and broken fences, but the slower kind where someone tries to leverage power they shouldn't have, and you answer with receipts, calm persistence, and a willingness to sit in a metal chair under harsh lighting until the people on the other side of the table realize the risk of pushing you is greater than the satisfaction of winning. There was a cost, of course. The stress of wondering how far the board would go. The long evenings with papers spread across the dining table instead of doing anything fun. The awkward eye contact with neighbors who didn't know whether to take sides or stay quiet. For a while, home felt less like a sanctuary and more like the center of a small, intensely controlled universe. But there was a payoff too. Neighbors started coming to me with questions about notices they didn't understand. Not to start fights, but to make sure they weren't being pushed into something they had the right to resist. People whispered less and asked more. That alone made the whole conflict feel like it had mattered. Even Linda's role shifted. She stayed on the board for a while, but the next election brought a surge of new candidates who ran on phrases like transparency and reasonable enforcement. Turnout was higher than anyone could remember. The results changed the tone of the board table. The president's chair eventually had a new occupant, one who seemed more interested in balancing aesthetics and practicality than in hunting down anything that annoyed them. The community didn't turn into a utopia. There were still notices, still rules, still those occasional reminders that living behind a gate means accepting certain limits. But the line between reasonable guidelines and abuse of power had been dragged into the light and redrawn in a way everyone could see. On quiet evenings now, when the sprinklers hiss along the street and the air smells like damp soil and distant barbecue smoke, I look out at our lawn and remember that single line from the violation letter about potential foreclosure remedies. I think about how small the problem seemed and how big the threat was. And I think about the moment those threats were rolled back in a room where the lights hummed, the vents hissed, and an association finally realized that discretion doesn't mean do whatever you want. Living in a place like this will always come with a certain amount of homeowners association drama. That's just the price of coordinated landscaping and matching mailboxes. But there's a difference between drama you shrug off and drama you stand up to. This was one of the times it was worth standing up. Tell me your own dark lawn HOA horror in one sharp sentence. The thought of them having to justify all of that out loud, in a room with witnesses, was the first time this whole mess felt like it might tip back in our favor. I slid the cover letter and the chart into the front of the binder. Then I labeled the spine with a piece of tape and a black marker, Parcel 18B, Hearing Packet. It felt a little overdramatic, but in a community where people treated board meetings like stages, showing up prepared was its own kind of performance. Before I closed everything up for the night, I went back to the documents one last time, making sure I had woven in the key details, Bylaw 4.12, the accommodating language, the drought-tolerant focus from the city, the uneven enforcement on our street. I even included a printed screenshot of the city's water district page, where it praised homeowners using drought-tolerant lawns as leaders in responsible conservation. That went behind the photos, as quiet backup. As I snapped the binder shut, I realized something important. The board might still have the power to fine and threaten liens, but I had something they didn't, a clean, documented story that made sense. And in any conflict like this, the story that makes sense has a way of drawing people to it. This wasn't just homeowners association drama anymore. It was a test of how far one small committee could push before someone drew a line and pushed back with receipts instead of just complaints. The next day, I woke up early. The sky was a pale gray blue, the air cool and still. I walked out to the front yard and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the lawn as cars began to roll out for morning commutes. The grass had that almost velvety look again, the darker green soaking up the soft light. It didn't look like an eyesore. It looked like what it was, a conscious, responsible choice. One car slowed, and the driver gave a small nod before turning the corner. It wasn't much, but it felt like a tiny vote. Back inside, I set the binder near the front door so I wouldn't forget it. The hearing was scheduled for 6 p.m. in the clubhouse. The final notice dated May 12 had warned about additional enforcement actions if we failed to appear. We weren't just going to appear. We were going to occupy the room. As late afternoon tipped toward evening and the light outside shifted to a deeper gold, I got ready. I dressed like I would for a semi-formal meeting, nothing flashy, just neat and steady. The binder felt heavy in my hand, not because of the paper, but because of what it represented. Every tab, every highlighted line, every printed photo was a small refusal to let someone else's taste dictate my home. On the walk to the clubhouse, I could hear sprinklers hissing on nearby lawns and the faint screech of a distant hawk over the open space behind the houses. The clubhouse itself sat at the end of the main loop, its big windows catching the last of the sun. By the time I reached the door, a few other residents were already going in. Some glanced at the binder and then at me, putting the pieces together. A couple gave small, sympathetic half-smiles. Nobody said anything, but their expressions said enough. They knew our lot number, and they knew why we were here. Inside, the air conditioning hit with a soft whoosh, and the overhead lights buzzed faintly. At the far end of the room, a long folding table had been set up for the board, with name placards and water bottles lined up. In front of it were rows of metal chairs for owners. On the side table, there was a printed sign-in sheet and a stack of agendas. I signed in, took an agenda, and saw our item listed again, this time under individual hearings. Item 3, Parcel 18B, non-uniform landscape appearance, possible fine continuation, possible lien direction. I sat down in a chair near the front and set the binder on my lap. The cover felt smooth and cool under my hand, the edges of the plastic sleeves faintly catching the light. The room slowly filled. The murmur of low conversation mixed with the hum of the vents. Linda took her usual spot at the center of the board table, her hair perfectly styled, a thick folder open in front of her. Mr. K sat to her right, tapping his pen against a calculator, as if the numbers mattered more than the people behind them. They didn't know every page I had in that binder yet. They didn't know how carefully Bylaw 4.12 had been turned from a weapon back into a shield. They didn't know how ready I was to walk them through their own uneven enforcement in front of their neighbors, step by step. They would find out soon enough. And the best part was, they would have to keep their voices calm and polite while they did. The board meeting started the way they always do in a place like Cypress Ridge, calm voices, shuffling papers, the soft hum of the air conditioning doing most of the talking. From my chair near the front, I could see every twitch on the board members' faces. The fluorescent lights overhead made the white tablecloth on their folding table look almost clinical, like we were in a lab instead of a clubhouse. Linda sat in the middle, posture straight, a neat stack of files in front of her. Mr. K rested his hand over his calculator, as if he was ready to total someone's financial pain at a moment's notice. They worked through the early agenda items first. Maintenance updates. Pool key replacements. A brief discussion about a cracked sidewalk slab on another street. The usual chorus of small suburban crises, handled with the same serious tone you'd expect for something far more dramatic. Then they moved to individual hearings. When they called our lot number, a small ripple went through the rows of chairs. Nothing loud, just the subtle shift of people sitting up a little straighter, the way you do when the story everyone's been whispering about finally gets to the interesting part. I stood, picked up my binder, and walked to the chair set aside near the front. The room sounded bigger up there, somehow. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent bulbs, the soft whir of the ceiling vents, even the rustle of someone shifting in their metal chair behind me. The air felt cooler on my face than it had in the parking lot. The association manager said a few formal words about the purpose of the hearing and the violation under review. No one needed to repeat the details. They were all sitting inside that final notice dated May 12th, printed in bold and tucked inside my binder. When they nodded for me to begin, I opened the binder and started with the calmest thing I could think of, the original approval. I explained that before we ever laid down a single blade of that darker fescue, we had filled out the association's own landscape modification form. I mentioned the date, March 3rd. I described how the design review board had stamped it, approved as submitted, and how their own handwritten note called the plan harmonious and drought-tolerant. I slid the plastic sleeve forward on the table so they could see the stamp and signature for themselves. Then I flipped to Bylaw 4.12. I didn't read it word for word. I paraphrased the parts that mattered: substantially uniform, consistent with community aesthetic, encouraging water-wise and drought-tolerant choices, accommodated to the greatest extent. Every time I emphasized those phrases, I saw the tiniest flicker in Mr. K's expression, like he was already doing the math on what this might mean if we didn't back down. Next came the chart. I laid it out in front of them: courtesy notice, violation letter, orange door tag, final notice dated May 12th, hearing. Dates in the middle column, rules cited in the third. At the bottom, that final note: original approval on file, no prior documented concerns regarding lawn color before escalation. Behind me, a chair creaked softly as someone shifted. The room felt like it had leaned in. Finally, I turned to the photos. I didn't call out anyone by name or address. I just explained that our street had always had variations in lawn appearance: patchy slopes, creeping thyme, artificial turf, ornamental grasses that didn't match the default shade. I pointed out that, to my knowledge, none of those had been tagged, fined, or dragged into a hearing. I didn't accuse anyone of favoritism. I simply said that when a rule about uniformity is applied to one lot but ignored for others, it starts to feel less like a rule and more like personal taste with paperwork. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted just a little. I was still the one in the hot seat, sitting alone in the chair while they lined the table like a panel. But I had changed what we were talking about. It was no longer dark lawn versus rule. It was board behavior versus board language. And the board's language, printed in their own documents, wasn't backing them up. The climax started quietly too. After I finished, there was a long moment where the only sound in the room was the hiss of cool air from the ceiling vent, washing gently over the rows of faces. One board member flipped through the packet I'd set in front of them, pages making that dry, quick sound that always feels louder in a quiet room. The association manager spoke first, reviewing the official position. The lawn was non-uniform. The board had discretion. The fines were authorized. The lien warning in the final notice dated May 12 was described as standard language. It all sounded very polished and procedural. But the words were floating in the same air as my binder now, and you could feel the conflict between the two. Linda tried to frame it as a simple aesthetic concern. She leaned on phrases like neighborhood character and visual harmony, as if choosing darker grass was the same as painting a house neon orange. She made it sound like the darker lawn was causing widespread unrest, even though the only unrest evident in the room was the tension rolling off a few neighbors who knew how hard their own yards worked to survive the heat. What changed the tone wasn't anything dramatic, I said. It was the moment another board member, one who hadn't spoken yet, asked a quiet question about our original approval. He flipped the page back, read the note that called our lawn harmonious and water-wise, and asked why the design review board's decision had been reversed without a new DRB review. He mentioned the language in Bylaw 4.12 about accommodating owners making good faith efforts toward drought tolerance. He didn't say the word arbitrary. He didn't have to. The treasurer shifted uneasily, tapping the end of his pen against the table. From the second row, someone murmured under their breath and then fell silent. The tension in the room changed from "this owner is in trouble" to "this board might have overreached." This was the legal consequence moment I had been building toward. If the board kept pushing the fines and the lien threat in the face of their own written approval and their own bylaw language, they weren't just being picky. They were putting themselves in a position where their enforcement could be attacked as inconsistent, unfair, and possibly challenged in ways they wouldn't be able to control. The same documents they had been using as a weapon could become a spotlight shining straight back at them. The association manager must have felt that shift too, because the tone softened. They asked me what, in my view, a reasonable resolution would look like. I took a breath, feeling the cool air from the vent move across my face, and kept my answer simple. I said I wanted the violation rescinded, the fines removed, and the lien threat withdrawn, based on our existing approval and the language about drought-tolerant accommodation. I added that I would like the board to review its enforcement practices for landscape uniformity and clarify the standard going forward so that no one else ended up in the same position we were in, approved one year, punished the next for the same thing. I didn't mention lawsuits. I didn't wave threats around. But the implication was hanging there anyway, silently resting on top of Bylaw 4.12, the final notice dated May 12, and the photo of our darker lawn that looked less like an eyesore and more like common sense. The board moved us out of the room briefly so they could deliberate. I stepped into the hallway with my binder, the clubhouse door closing behind me with a soft click. Out in the hallway, the air felt warmer, and the muffled sound of the meeting inside made a low, indistinct hum. I could smell cut grass faintly through the open side door, mixing with the scent of floor cleaner and old carpet. A few residents who weren't part of the hearing walked by, giving me curious looks. I would have loved to explain every detail on the spot, but all I could do was wait. Those 10 minutes felt longer than the entire week leading up to the hearing. When they called me back in, I could already read something in their faces before they said a word. They looked less confident, less certain that this was a simple disciplinary matter. Linda's posture was still straight, but the set of her jaw was tighter. Mr. K's fingers hovered over his calculator without touching it. The decision they delivered was dressed in cautious, formal language, but the core message came through clearly enough. The board was suspending all fines related to the landscape violation pending a formal design review board reevaluation of the approved plan. They were withdrawing the notice of potential lien from the final notice dated May 12. They acknowledged the existence of the prior approval and the need to clarify standards for water-wise landscaping in light of current drought conditions. They didn't use the words, "We went too far." They didn't apologize. But they had just yanked the teeth out of their own threat. My lawn was still under review, technically. The DRB could theoretically still cause trouble later. But the avalanche I'd been staring at all week, the daily fines, the lien, the auction threat hiding in the background, had been stopped in its tracks. And everyone in that room knew why. The aftermath of that decision didn't unfold overnight. It spread out over the next few weeks, like the sound of crickets drifting into open windows after dark and then lingering in the background. The first big change came quietly, a notice in our mailboxes announcing a landscape standards workshop hosted by the board and the design review board. The flyer talked about updating guidelines for water-wise landscaping and clarifying expectations for uniformity and color variation. It invited homeowners to attend, contribute, and bring photos of their own yards. There was no mention of my name, my lot number, or the hearing. But I could see our fingerprints all over it.